There is a filing cabinet in Ottawa that contains the cargo manifests for nearly every convoy that departed Halifax Harbor between September 1939 and May 1945. The pages are thin, many of them typed on wartime grade onion skin that has yellowed to the color of old teeth. If you were to open the third drawer down and pull the hanging file labeled with the convoy designation HX71, you would find a 7-page cargo summary listing every crate, barrel, container, and sealed unit loaded aboard 3 vessels in late February of 1942. The list is meticulous. It accounts for 412 individual cargo items distributed across the holds of 3 merchant ships staged in Bedford Basin. Every entry has a weight, a classification code, a loading dock assignment, and an initialed receipt confirming it was stowed aboard its designated vessel. Every entry, that is, except one. Cargo item 2331 appears on the loading manifest, dated the 21st of February, 1942. It is described as a sealed military crate, dimensions 2 feet by 3 feet by 18 inches, with a weight listed at just over 47 pounds. Its classification code places it in the category of sensitive material, though not ordnance, not medical supply, not signals equipment. It was assigned to hold number 4 of a freighter, and the manifest records confirm it was signed aboard by a dockyard official whose surname appears to read Burwell or Burl. The handwriting smudged at the final letters. Everything about this entry is ordinary. Wonder why it fits the bureaucratic pattern of a cargo record produced in haste under blackout conditions by men who had already processed 3 convoys that week. There is absolutely nothing wrong with entry 2331, except that it has no corresponding arrival receipt in Liverpool, no transfer confirmation at any intermediate port, no notation in the vessel's own hold inventory, and no record anywhere in the British Admiralty archives that it was ever received, opened, inspected, lost, damaged, or destroyed. The crate was loaded, it was signed for, and then, as far as every surviving document is concerned, it simply ceased to exist. Imagine an entire wartime convoy reduced to 1 page of cargo records. Every crate is accounted for except one. That is not a mystery of the sea. It is not a story about a torpedo or a storm or a loading accident. It is something far more unsettling. It is the story of a bureaucratic system so thorough it could track the movement of every rivet in a ship's hull and every tin of bully beef in a convoy's galley, and yet somehow allow one object to pass through the center of its apparatus and leave no final trace. What follows is not the story of what was inside that crate. No one knows. It is not the story of who lost it, because the record does not say. It is, instead, the story of how official systems can preserve the machinery of movement while quietly, efficiently, and permanently erasing the truth of what actually happened. If you listen carefully, if you follow the paper trail as it descends through layers of military classification, harbor bureaucracy, railway logistics, and sealed archives, you will begin to understand something that the filing cabinets in Ottawa will never quite admit. Not that the crate was lost, but that the system was never designed to prevent that kind of disappearance. It was designed in ways no one would ever publicly acknowledge to make it possible. And this is where we begin, not with the crate itself, but with the harbor that received it, because to understand how something vanishes inside a system of perfect records, you first have to understand the system. And in the winter of 1942, There was no system on the Atlantic seaboard more elaborate, more heavily documented, or more deliberately hidden from public view than the one that operated out of Halifax, Nova Scotia. Bedford Basin, if you have never seen it, is a body of water that seems designed for concealment. It sits behind the narrow throat of Halifax Harbor like a secret held behind closed teeth, its wide oval surface invisible from the open Atlantic. A ship entering Halifax from the sea would navigate the main harbor channel, passing between the dockyards on the western shore and the city of Dartmouth on the east, and then, at the point where the harbor appears to end, would slip through the Narrows, a passage barely a quarter-mile wide, and emerge into the basin beyond. The transition was startling. One moment you were in a working harbor, hemmed in by piers and cranes and warehouses. The next you were in a vast, calm anchorage ringed by low wooded hills, its surface dotted with the gray shapes of dozens or hundreds of ships riding at anchor, their masts and funnels rising above the morning fog like the spires of a drowned city. And the basin had served as a naval anchorage since long before the Second World War. During the First World War, it had been the assembly point for the convoys that carried Canadian troops and material to Europe. And it was during that earlier conflict that Halifax had earned its grim credentials as a city that understood the cost of wartime shipping. On the morning of December 6, 1917, the French munitions ship Mont Blanc, loaded with thousands of tons of explosives, collided with another vessel in the Narrows and caught fire. The explosion that followed was the largest man-made detonation the world had seen before Hiroshima. It flattened 2 square kilometers of the city, killed nearly 2,000 people, and, crucially, seen for our story, destroyed an unknown quantity of harbor records, customs documents, Yatridu, and shipping manifests that had been stored in the waterfront buildings obliterated by the blast. The 1917 explosion created a literal archival void in the history of Halifax Harbor. Records that had existed were gone. Cargo that had been documented was no longer documented. The paper trail of an entire era of maritime activity was, in the space of a single morning, reduced to ash and rubble. It is a precedent worth holding in mind, not because the Second World War produced a similar catastrophic destruction of records. It did not, but because it illustrates a principle that applies to all documentary systems, that records are physical objects, and physical objects can be destroyed. The filing cabinets in Ottawa survived the war. The manifests inside them survived the war. But the system that produced those manifests was not immune to loss. Records were lost at every stage, to fire, to water, to the routine destruction of post-war file reductions, to the simple entropy of paper stored in imperfect conditions over decades. And each loss, whether dramatic or mundane, removed another piece of the picture, another link in a chain, another page from a file that might, if it had survived, explain something that the remaining pages cannot. The men who operated the Halifax dockyard during the Second World War were acutely aware of this fragility. Many of them had lived through the 1917 explosion or had heard the stories from those who had. They understood that paper was vulnerable. They understood that records could be lost. And yet the system they operated demanded paper, demanded it in enormous quantities, at enormous speed, under conditions that made careful preservation almost impossible. The intake logs were filled out on clipboards in the open air, in rain and sleet and freezing spray. The manifests were typed on machines whose ribbons were not always fresh, whose keys sometimes stuck, whose operators were sometimes working their second 12-hour shift in a row. The tally sheets were compiled at the end of long days by clerks whose primary concern was completing the paperwork before the next convoy began its loading cycle. The system demanded thoroughness, and the men who operated it gave it thoroughness. But thoroughness under these conditions was a relative thing, relative to the weather, the hour, the fatigue, the light, the cold. And the records that resulted were thorough in the aggregate, while being in individual instances and imprecise, inconsistent, or simply wrong. If you had stood on the heights of Citadel Hill in Halifax on any morning during the winter of 1942, and if the fog had lifted just enough to let you see the harbor below, you would have witnessed something that no newspaper was allowed to describe, no photographer was permitted to capture, and no civilian was supposed to fully understand. Below you, stretching from the narrows of the harbor out into the vast oval of Bedford Basin, you would have seen ships. Not a handful, not a fleet, a floating city. As many as 145 ocean-going vessels could be anchored in Bedford Basin at a single time during the war's peak convoy years. Merchant ships, tankers, ammunition carriers, refrigerated cargo vessels, troop transports, all of them waiting in column formation for the order to sail. The basin itself was nearly 2 miles across, a natural deep water anchorage protected by the Narrows that connected it to the main harbor and then to the open Atlantic beyond. The Royal Canadian Navy had recognized its strategic value within weeks of the war's declaration, and by 1940, Halifax had become the western terminus of the most important supply chain in the Allied war effort. The HX convoy series, the fast convoys capable of 9 knots or more, carrying everything Britain needed to survive. The scale of what moved through Halifax is difficult to hold in the mind. Munitions, fuel, food, raw materials, machine parts, aircraft components, medical supplies, personal effects of tens of thousands of troops, diplomatic correspondence, scientific equipment, and, though this would not be publicly known until after the war, the entire gold reserves and negotiable securities of the British Empire. All of it passed through the same harbor, processed by the same overtaxed system of dockyard clerks, naval censors, stevedore gangs, customs officials, military police, and railway dispatchers. The port operated around the clock. Loading continued through the night under blackout conditions so strict that a lit cigarette on a dock could draw a reprimand from the harbor patrol. There is a particular quality to the silence of Bedford Basin on a winter morning that the men who served there during the war remembered long after the other details had faded. Several of the oral histories at the Maritime Museum describe it, not the silence of emptiness, because the basin was never empty during those years, but the silence of suppression. The ships did not sound their horns. Radio communication was restricted. The harbor patrol enforced noise discipline as rigorously as it enforced the blackout. The result was a vast body of water filled with enormous metal vessels, tankers, freighters, troop ships, escort corvettes, all of them inhabited, all of them crewed, all of them preparing for a voyage that many of their occupants would not survive, and all of them sitting in an almost preternatural quiet, the only sounds the lap of water against steel hulls and the occasional distant clang of a tool dropped on a deck. It was, as one former dockyard worker described it, like standing in a cathedral made of ships. The quiet was not peaceful. It was the quiet of men holding their breath. And into this quiet, the cargo moved. Day and night, under the blackout, the loading operations continued. The docks were lit, when they were lit at all, by hooded lamps that cast narrow downward pools of light on the paperwork and left everything above waist height in darkness. Stevedores worked by feel as much as by sight. guiding crates into cargo nets by the shapes of their shadows, listening for the particular groan of a crane cable under load that told them how much weight was hanging above their heads. The conditions were brutal. Halifax in February is a place of raw, wet cold, not the dry cold of the prairies, but a maritime cold that cuts through wool and oilskin and settles in the bones. The men who loaded the convoys worked in this cold for hours at a stretch, their hands cracking, their breath freezing on their scarves, their boots slipping on decks and docks that were perpetually glazed with a thin film of ice. Under these conditions, the careful, meticulous handling that the cargo manifests implied was, in practice, an aspiration rather than a reality. Crates were moved quickly because the men who moved them were cold and exhausted and wanted to finish their shift. Forms were filled out quickly because the clerks who filled them out were working under the same conditions, in the same cold, with the same fatigue. The system demanded precision, the conditions demanded speed, and the compromise between precision and speed was the fertile ground in which discrepancies grew. Ships were loaded, manifested, inspected, and moved to their anchorage positions in Bedford Basin, where they waited, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, until the convoy commodore gave the signal to form columns and make for the open sea. Everything about this process was documented. That is the first thing you need to understand. The military bureaucracy that managed Halifax Harbor during the Second World War was one of the most thorough documentation systems ever created under wartime pressure. Every vessel that entered the port was logged. Every cargo item that crossed a dock was tallied on intake sheets. Every crate that entered a warehouse was assigned a location code. Every transfer from dock to ship, from warehouse to rail car, from one classification level to another, generated a piece of paper, a receipt, a manifest line, an initialed tag, a stamped form. The Royal Canadian Navy's convoy reports of proceedings, preserved today in Record Group 24 at Library and Archives Canada, contain cargo sections so detailed that you can sometimes reconstruct not just what was loaded onto a particular ship, but in which order, by which stevedore gang, and at what approximate hour. The system was designed to ensure that nothing, not a single crate, not a single drum of fuel oil, not a single sealed diplomatic pouch, could move through Halifax without generating a paper trail. And yet paper trails, as anyone who has spent time in archives will tell you, are not the same thing as truth. A paper trail records that something happened. It records that a form was filled out, a box was ticked, a signature was applied. What it does not necessarily record is whether the thing that was supposed to happen actually did. A receipt confirms that someone signed for a crate. It does not confirm that the crate arrived at its destination. A manifest entry confirms that an item was listed for loading. It does not confirm that the item in the hold matched the item on the page. The documentation system at Halifax was extraordinary in its thoroughness, but thoroughness is not the same thing as accuracy, and accuracy is not the same thing as truth. The gap between those three words, thoroughness, accuracy, truth, is the space in which cargo item 2331 disappeared. Consider the conditions under which this paperwork was produced. The dockyard at Halifax operated at a pace that would be considered reckless in peacetime. During the peak convoy years of 1942 and 1943, where the port was processing convoys at a rate that sometimes left fewer than 48 hours between one departure and the next wave of incoming vessels. Stevedore gangs worked 12-hour shifts, often in freezing conditions, loading cargo by hand or with dock cranes that were, by the standards of the era, barely adequate for the volume they handled. The men who filled out the intake logs and manifest forms were working under the same pressure, in the same cold, with the same fatigue, and often under blackout conditions that made it difficult to read the very forms they were completing. Errors were not just possible, they were inevitable. Crate numbers were transposed, weight figures were rounded, classification codes were guessed at when the original shipping labels had been damaged in transit. And through it all, the system continued to produce its paper trail, complete, initialed, stamped, and filed, regardless of whether the reality beneath the paperwork was quite as tidy as the document suggested. This is not a criticism. It is a description of how all large-scale bureaucratic systems operate under stress. The forms exist to impose order on chaos. The signatures exist to assign responsibility. The filing systems exist to create the appearance of control. But the appearance of control and the reality of control are two different things. And in the winter of 1942, the gap between them was wide enough to lose a crate in. There is one more thing you need to understand about Halifax Harbor before we trace the path of cargo item 2331. The port did not operate as a single, unified system. It was, in practice, a layered series of overlapping jurisdictions, each with its own documentation chain, its own classification protocols, and its own reasons for keeping or discarding records. The Royal Canadian Navy controlled the convoy assembly and departure process. HMC Dockyard handled the physical loading and repair of vessels. Pier 21, which would later become famous as the entry point for post-war immigration, served during the war as a military embarkation facility. The Canadian Customs Service maintained its own inspection logs. The press censor's office, operating from within the city, maintained a separate registry of what could and could not be publicly disclosed about port operations. And overseeing all of this at a level that most dockyard workers never directly encountered, Chelly, was a classification system that divided cargo into tiers of secrecy, from ordinary commercial goods that required no special handling to items marked with codes that meant they were to be loaded under armed guard, transported in sealed compartments, and documented on manifests that were themselves classified. Cargo item 2331 bore a classification code that placed it in the sensitive material tier. Not the highest level, not the designation reserved for signals intelligence or diplomatic pouches or the unmarked crates of Operation Fish that carried the gold reserves of the British Empire in boxes stenciled with the word fish as a threadbare cover story. But sensitive enough that its handling would have been restricted, its documentation would have been limited to a smaller number of authorized clerks, and its passage through the dockyard would have followed a different route than ordinary cargo. This is important because it means that even as the standard documentation system was generating its meticulous paper trail for the hundreds of other items loaded alongside entry 2331, the crate itself may have been processed through a parallel system, one that generated fewer records, involved fewer witnesses, and was, by design, less transparent than the primary logistics chain. This is the first fissure in the story, not a crack in the crate, but a crack in the record. The moment a cargo item enters a restricted handling stream, it moves from the world of abundant documentation into a world of deliberate scarcity. Fewer people process it. Fewer forms are generated. Fewer copies are made. And when, decades later, a researcher opens a filing cabinet in Ottawa and tries to trace that item from loading dock to final destination, the trail does not break dramatically, it simply thins. It narrows. The entries become shorter, the handwriting more hurried, the details more vague. And then, at some point between the Halifax dock and the place the crate was supposed to arrive, the trail does not end. It just stops being there, as if the paper itself had decided that the story was over. To understand how cargo item 2331 entered the Halifax system, you have to understand the system it entered, not just its physical infrastructure, but its rhythm. The HX convoys that departed Halifax followed a pattern that had been refined under enormous pressure since the first months of the war. A convoy did not simply form and sail. It assembled over days, done sometimes weeks, as individual merchant ships arrived from ports along the eastern seaboard, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Sydney, and Cape Breton, and were guided through the harbor narrows into the anchorage at Bedford Basin. Each arriving vessel carried its own cargo manifest, its own set of loading records from its port of origin, and its own complement of paperwork that had to be reconciled with the Halifax dockyard's master ledger before the ship could be cleared for convoy assignment. The reconciliation process was, in theory, straightforward. A vessel arrived. Its manifest was presented to the dockyard office. The cargo listed on the manifest was checked against the physical contents of the holds, or more accurately, against the tallies that the ship's own officers had compiled during loading at the previous port. Discrepancies were noted. Damaged items were flagged. Items that required special handling, hazardous materials, classified cargo, perishable goods, were identified and assigned to the appropriate processing stream. The vessel was then given a berth assignment, either at one of the piers or at anchor in the basin, and its cargo became part of the larger convoy manifest that would accompany the fleet across the Atlantic. In practice, the reconciliation process was anything but straightforward. The volume of shipping that passed through Halifax during the peak years was staggering. In 1942 alone, the port handled more convoys than in any other year of the war, and the pressure on the dockyard staff was relentless. Ships arrived at irregular intervals, often in worse condition than expected, their manifests incomplete or damaged, their holds loaded in ways that did not match the paperwork. Stevedore gangs were frequently required to partially unload and reload vessels to correct stowage problems or to redistribute cargo among convoy ships, a process that generated additional paperwork, additional opportunities for error, and additional layers of documentation that had to be reconciled before departure. It was during one of these periods of intense convoy preparation, in the third week of February 1942, that a sealed military crate was entered into the Halifax dockyard's intake log under the designation that would eventually appear on the convoy manifest as Item 2331. The intake entry is sparse. It records the crate's dimensions, its approximate weight, and its classification code. It records the date and the dock number where it was received. It records the initials of the clerk who processed it. What it does not record is where the crate came from before it reached the dock. This is not unusual in itself. Intake logs at Halifax often omitted origin information for classified items, listing only the fact of arrival and the assigned handling stream. But it means that the documentary trail for cargo item 2331 begins not at the beginning of the crate's journey, but at the moment it entered the Halifax system. Everything before that moment is blank. There are several plausible explanations for how the crate reached Halifax, and each of them carries its own implications. May have arrived aboard one of the feeder ships that brought cargo from American ports under the Lend-Lease program, in which case it would have originated in the United States Warshipping Administration's logistics chain. a system whose records are well preserved in American archives, but whose interface with the Canadian dockyard system was notoriously prone to discrepancies. Cross-border cargo transfers between American and Canadian military logistics during the war produced a category of documentation mismatch that archivists have been trying to untangle ever since. Items that appeared on American shipping manifests sometimes failed to appear on Canadian intake logs, and vice versa, not because the items were lost, but because the two systems used different classification codes, different weight standards, and different procedures for handling sensitive material. Masu, a crate that was perfectly well documented in the American system, could arrive in Halifax and enter the Canadian system as a near anonymous object, its history effectively reset to zero by the act of crossing an administrative boundary. Alternatively, the crate may have originated within Canada itself from one of the military research facilities, weapons depots, or supply centers that fed material into the Halifax pipeline. The Directorate of Scientific Research, the Ordnance Board, and the National Research Council all shipped classified material through Halifax during the war, and their internal documentation systems were, in many cases, even more restrictive than the dockyard's own. A crate originating from one of these agencies might have arrived at the dock accompanied by nothing more than a sealed envelope containing handling instructions and a classification code. The contents of the crate, known only to the sending agency and theoretically to the receiving agency at the other end of the Atlantic crossing. There is a third possibility, one that carries the most weight in the context of what happened next. The crate may have been part of a special transfer, one of the highly classified shipments that moved through Halifax under protocols so restrictive that they generated almost no paperwork at all within the standard dockyard system. The most famous of these special transfers was Operation Fish, the secret movement of British gold bullion and negotiable securities from Britain to Canadian vaults, Oron, which used Halifax as its primary transit point. During Operation Fish, crates containing hundreds of millions of pounds in gold bars and securities were loaded onto warships and merchant vessels at Halifax, transported under armed guard, and delivered to secure facilities in Ottawa and Montreal. The crates were deliberately mislabeled. Their manifests used code words. Their handling was restricted to a tiny circle of authorized personnel, and the documentation they generated within the Halifax dockyard system was, by explicit design, minimal, because the fewer records that existed, the fewer records could be intercepted, stolen, or leaked. Cargo item 2331 was not, as far as anyone can determine, an Operation Fish shipment. Its weight is wrong, too light for gold, too heavy for securities alone. Its classification code does not match the known Operation Fish designations, but the protocols that governed Operation Fish did not exist in isolation. They were part of a broader culture of classified cargo handling at Halifax, a culture in which the deliberate minimization of documentation was not an accident or an oversight, but a security measure. And it is this culture, this institutionalized habit of creating as few records as possible for the most sensitive shipments, that provides the first clue to understanding how cargo item 2331 could be loaded onto a ship in Halifax Harbor and then vanish from every subsequent record. The next entry in the documentary trail appears on the convoy manifest itself, the master document that listed every cargo item assigned to every vessel in the convoy. The manifest confirms that item 2331 was assigned to hold number 4 of a freighter scheduled to sail as part of the convoy, departing in late February 1942. The entry is consistent with the intake log, same dimensions, same weight, same classification code. But there is a detail on the manifest that does not appear on the intake log, and it is this detail that introduces the first genuine anomaly in the record. The manifest includes a column for what the dockyard clerks called the transfer notation, a brief code indicating how the cargo item moved from the intake dock to the ship. For most items, this notation records a straightforward dock-to-ship transfer. The crate was carried or trucked from the receiving dock to the vessel's berth and loaded directly into the designated hold. For item 2331, the transfer notation indicates something different. It records a two-stage movement, first from the intake dock to a warehouse facility, and then from the warehouse to the ship. This means the crate did not go directly aboard. It was taken to one of the dockyard storage buildings, the sprawling timber-framed sheds that line the waterfront or the more secure facilities near Bedford Basin, and held there for some period before being transported to the vessel for loading. Warehouse storage was not unusual for classified cargo. Items that required special handling were frequently held in secure storage until the convoy's sailing date was confirmed, at which point they were moved to the ship under guard. But warehouse storage added a link to the chain of documentation, a link that, for cargo item 2331, appears to have generated a contradiction that no one noticed at the time and that no one has been able to resolve since. The warehouse's own internal tally sheet for the period in question has survived, and it is held in a collection at the Nova Scotia Archives that was not open to researchers until the early 1990s. The tally sheet records incoming and outgoing items for a 5-day period that overlaps with the dates on which item 2331 would have been in storage. The sheet records 23 incoming items during that period and 23 outgoing items. The numbers match perfectly. But when the individual entries are compared against the convoy manifest, one of the outgoing items listed on the tally sheet does not correspond to any item on the manifest, and item 2331, which the manifest says was transferred through the warehouse, does not appear on the tally sheet at all. This is a small discrepancy in the context of a harbor processing hundreds of cargo items per day under wartime pressure. It is the kind of discrepancy that could easily be explained by clerical error, a transposed number, a misread code, a tally entry made from memory at the end of a long shift, rather than from direct observation. But it is also the kind of discrepancy that, once noticed, refuses to resolve, because if item 2331 passed through the warehouse, it should appear on the tally sheet, and if it does not appear on the tally sheet, then either the manifest transfer notation is wrong and the crate went directly to the ship, or the crate did pass through the warehouse but was processed outside the normal tally system, which would imply a level of restricted handling that goes beyond what its classification code would ordinarily require. And so the first real question emerges, not where the crate went, but how it was handled, because the way a crate moves through a system determines what records it leaves behind, and the records it leaves behind determine whether its story can ever be reconstructed. If cargo item 2331 was handled through normal channels, there should be a continuous paper trail from intake to loading. If it was handled through restricted channels, the trail would be thinner but still traceable through classified records. But if it was handled through some intermediate process, partly documented, partly restricted, partly improvised in the chaos of a dockyard operating at the edge of its capacity, then the trail could be exactly what it appears to be, a series of fragments that almost connect but never quite do. A story told in broken sentences with the crucial words missing. This brings us to the people who would have physically handled the crate, the stevedore gangs, the dockyard workers, the military police, the warehouse clerks, and the question of what, if anything, they remembered. Because paper is not the only source of evidence, memory is another. And in the case of cargo item 2331, the surviving fragments of human memory tell a story that does not quite match the story told by the documents. The oral history collections at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax contain several recorded interviews with men who worked on the docks during the war. The interviews were conducted in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when many of the surviving dockyard workers were in their 60s and 70s, and they cover a range of topics: working conditions, the blackout, the cold, the constant pressure of the convoy schedule, the occasional terrifying reminder that the cargo they were handling could kill them if mishandled. Several of the interviews contain references to unusual or memorable cargo, crates that were heavier than expected, items that arrived without proper labeling, shipments that were handled by armed guards in a way that made the regular dockyard workers uneasy. The one interview in particular has attracted the attention of researchers interested in the question of classified cargo handling at Halifax. The subject, a former stevedore, identified in the archive only by his first name and last initial, a standard practice in oral history collections of that era, describes an incident that he places in the winter of 1941 or 1942 during a period of particularly heavy convoy activity. He recalls being part of a gang assigned to load cargo into the hold of a freighter at one of the main piers. During the loading process, he says, the gang was ordered to stop work and clear the area around the hatch, while a separate team, men he did not recognize, not regular dockyard workers, brought aboard a single crate under the supervision of a military police officer. The crate, he recalls, was wooden, of moderate size, and appeared to be heavy for its dimensions. It was lowered into the hold using the ship's own crane rather than the dock crane, which he found unusual. The gang was then ordered to resume loading around the crate, which had been placed in a position that, he notes with the precision of a man who spent years stacking cargo, did not correspond to the normal loading pattern for that section of the hold. The former stevedore's account is vivid and specific. He remembers the cold. He remembers the sound of the crane. He remembers the military police officer's insignia. He remembers that the crate had no visible shipping label, only a stenciled number that he cannot recall. What he does not remember is the name of the ship, the exact date, or the convoy designation. And when researchers have attempted to cross-reference his account with the dockyard records for the period he describes, they have found no entry in any loading log that corresponds to the incident as he recounts it. The official records for the ships loaded during that period show standard cargo operations with no notation of a suspended loading sequence, no record of a military police escort for any individual cargo item, and no indication that any external team was brought in to handle a restricted shipment. This does not mean the stevedore is lying. Memory, particularly memory recalled decades after the fact, is a notoriously unreliable narrator. Dates blur. Details migrate from one event to another. A crate handled in January becomes, in the retelling, a crate handled in February. A ship loaded at Pier 3 becomes a ship loaded at Pier 4. The emotional texture of the memory, the cold, the tension, the sense that something unusual was happening, may be perfectly accurate even if the specific details have shifted over time, but it also does not mean the records are correct, because the records, as we have already seen, were produced under conditions that made accuracy difficult and were maintained within a system that had institutional reasons for limiting what was documented. There is another interview in the oral history collection that bears mentioning, though its connection to cargo item 2331 is even more tenuous than the first. The subject is a retired railway worker who spent part of the war assigned to the military freight service at Halifax. He describes the routine of loading classified shipments onto rail cars for transport to Ottawa and Montreal, the armed guards, the sealed manifests, the practice of parking the loaded rail cars inside the secure perimeter until the scheduled departure time. He recalls one occasion, he cannot give the date, and he is vague about the details, when a shipment that had been loaded onto a rail car was partially unloaded before departure. He remembers being told that one of the items in the shipment had been redirected, his word, and that a military vehicle had come to collect it. He does not remember what the item was, how large it was, or where the military vehicle took it. He remembers only that the paperwork for the shipment was adjusted after the fact, the rail manifest rewritten to reflect the reduced number of items, and that the original manifest, the one that had included the redirected item, was collected by the guard and presumably destroyed. This account, like the Steve Doors account, is unverifiable. The dates are uncertain. The details are vague. The documentary record, such as it survives, neither confirms nor contradicts the story, but it describes a process, the post hoc adjustment of a manifest to reflect a change in the physical cargo that is entirely consistent with what we know about classified freight handling at Halifax. If a crate was redirected at the last moment, pulled from a shipment for reasons that the railway workers were not told, the paperwork would be adjusted to match the new reality. The original manifest, which recorded the crate's presence, would be replaced by a new manifest that did not, and the paper trail of the redirected crate would, at that moment, cease to exist in the rail system's documentation. The crate would not be lost. It would not be stolen. It would simply be removed from the record, cleanly, officially, and with the full authority of whatever agency had ordered the redirection. The system would show no gap. The numbers on the new manifest would add up, and the crate, wherever it went next, would enter whatever documentation system the receiving agency maintained. A system whose records might or might not be preserved, might or might not be declassified, might or might not be accessible to researchers decades later. This is what the railway workers' account suggests, if it is accurate. Not that something went wrong, but that the system had a built-in mechanism for making things disappear from its own records, not through error or corruption, but through the legitimate exercise of authority by agencies that operated above the level of the documentation system itself. A sufficiently senior official, acting within the scope of wartime authority, could redirect a crate, adjust a manifest, and effectively erase the crate's documentary existence within a particular logistics chain. The crate would continue to exist physically. It would continue to be tracked, presumably by whatever agency had claimed it, but in the records of the system from which it had been removed, it would leave no trace, or at most the faint trace of a number that appeared on one manifest and not on the next. A discrepancy so small that no one would notice it unless they were specifically looking for it. This is the fundamental tension at the heart of the Halifax crate mystery. On one side, you have the documentary record, incomplete, sometimes contradictory, but officially sanctioned and physically preserved. On the other side, you have human memory, a vivid, emotionally resonant, but unverifiable, and subject to the distortions of time. Neither source is reliable on its own, and where they conflict, where a stevedore remembers something that the records do not show, the conflict itself becomes a kind of evidence. Not evidence of what happened, but evidence of the gap between what happened and what the system chose to record. And it is in that gap, in the space between memory and paper, that cargo item 2331 begins its disappearance. Not with a dramatic event, not with a theft or a sinking or an explosion, but with a quiet discrepancy. A tally sheet that does not match a manifest, a memory that does not match a log, a system that was designed to record everything, and yet, anyways, in this one small instance, appears to have recorded just enough to prove that something existed while failing to record enough to prove where it went. Let the thought settle for a moment. Let it rest alongside everything else you have heard so far. The filing cabinet in Ottawa, the harbor full of ships, the blackout and the cold, the tally sheet with its perfect numbers that do not quite add up. The old stevedore's memory of a crate lowered into a hold by men he did not know. None of these things by themselves explain what happened to cargo item 2331. But together they begin to describe something, not a story exactly, but to the shape of a story, the outline of an absence, the shadow of a thing that was there and then was not, preserved in the negative space between documents that almost agree but never fully do. Now we descend another level, because the warehouse discrepancy and the stevedore's unverifiable memory are only the first layer of the problem. Beneath them lies a deeper structural question, one that has less to do with cargo item 2331 specifically, and more to do with the nature of the documentation system itself. And to understand that system, you have to understand something that was not publicly known until years after the war ended. You have to understand how Halifax handled its secrets. The most dramatic example of secret cargo handling at Halifax was Operation Fish, the covert transfer of Britain's gold reserves and negotiable securities to Canadian vaults, which took place between 1940 and 1945, and which moved, by some estimates, the equivalent of more than 200 billion pounds in modern currency through the port of Halifax without a single public disclosure. The operation was conceived in the desperate early months of the war, when the possibility of a German invasion of Britain was considered not merely plausible but imminent. The British government determined that its gold reserves, the financial foundation of the entire Allied war effort, could not be allowed to fall into enemy hands. The decision was made to ship the gold to Canada, where it would be stored in the vaults of the Bank of Canada and the Sun Life building in Montreal, beyond the reach of German bombers and German armies. The logistics of Operation Fish were extraordinary. Gold bars weighing 400 troy ounces each were packed into standard military crates. The wooden metal sheathed boxes built to the MIL-C-104 specification that were used for virtually all overseas military shipments. The crates were then labeled with innocuous descriptions. Actually, the most famous cover designation was the word fish, which appeared on manifests and shipping labels, as though the crates contained nothing more interesting than tinned sardines. But other cover descriptions were also used: special stores, scientific samples, engineering parts, anything that would deflect attention from the true contents. The crates were transported to Halifax under armed guard, loaded onto warships or specially designated merchant vessels, and sailed across the Atlantic under maximum escort protection. At every stage of the process, Documentation was kept to an absolute minimum. Manifests were classified. Loading logs were restricted. The stevedore gangs that handled the crates were told nothing about their contents, and the dockyard clerks who processed the paperwork were given only the cover descriptions, not the actual contents, which meant that the official record of what passed through the dock was, in a very precise sense, a fiction. Operation Fish succeeded. The gold arrived safely, the securities were secured, and the British government's official history of the operation, compiled after the war, makes a remarkable claim that not a single piece of the treasure went missing during the entire multi-year transfer. Not one gold bar, not one bearer bond, not one crate out of the thousands that moved through the system. It is a claim that is almost certainly true in its broad strokes. The gold was accounted for, the vaults were audited, the numbers reconciled. But it is also a claim that reveals, in its very confidence, the central paradox of classified cargo handling. The system that moved the gold was designed to be untraceable. The manifests were fictions. The labels were lies. The documentation was deliberately incomplete, and yet the official history asserts that the system's accounting was perfect, that every item was tracked, every crate was received, every ounce of gold was verified. The question that no one asks, because the operation's success makes it seem unnecessary, is simple. How would you know if something had gone missing from a system that was specifically designed to leave no trace? This is not an accusation. There is no evidence that anything was stolen from Operation Fish. And the audit trail, such as it is, supports the official account. But the question matters because it illuminates the structural vulnerability of classified cargo systems. When documentation is deliberately minimized for security reasons, the same features that protect the cargo from interception also protect the system from scrutiny. A crate that moves through a minimal documentation stream is a crate that cannot be independently tracked by anyone outside the authorized circle. If it arrives at its destination, the system is validated. If it does not arrive, the system has very few mechanisms for determining where the failure occurred, because the mechanisms that would normally provide that information, the redundant paper trails and cross-reference logs, are the very things that were removed in the name of security. Cargo item 2331 was not gold. Its weight and classification code make that clear. But it moved through a system that had been shaped by the culture of Operation Fish, a system in which the deliberate suppression of documentation was not a failure but a feature, not an accident but a policy. And it is within this culture that the next stage of the crate's journey must be understood. The convoy manifest records that item 2331 was loaded aboard its assigned vessel. The ship sailed as part of the convoy in late February 1942. The convoy crossed the Atlantic under escort and arrived with losses at its destination ports in the United Kingdom. The convoy's overall cargo was received and processed by British port authorities. And it is here, in the arrival records maintained by the British Ministry of War Transport, that the trail of cargo item 2331 should resume. A loading record in Halifax should correspond to an arrival record in Liverpool or Glasgow or one of the other convoy destination ports. The item number should appear. The classification code should match. A receipt should have been signed by a British dockyard official confirming that the item was unloaded, inspected, and either forwarded to its final destination or entered into a British military warehouse. It is worth dwelling on what it meant in practical terms. For a ship to cross the Atlantic in convoy in February of 1942. The convoy system was not merely a logistical arrangement, it was an act of collective endurance. The merchant ships, most of them old, many of them poorly maintained, were required to maintain station in a formation that stretched across miles of ocean. Columns of vessels sailing at matched speeds, maintaining matched headings through some of the most violent weather on Earth. The North Atlantic in winter produced waves that could reach 60 feet. Gale force winds were not exceptions, but expectations. Ships rolled and pitched so severely that cargo shifted in the holds, snapping lashings and sending crates sliding across steel decks in the darkness below. Every convoy crossing produced cargo damage, and the damage was frequently extensive. Crates crushed, containers breached, contents contaminated by seawater that poured through hatches that were never designed to withstand the force of a North Atlantic winter storm. And above the weather, there were the submarines. In February of 1942, the German U-boat campaign in the Atlantic was entering its most devastating phase. Under the period that the U-boat crews themselves called the Second Happy Time had begun, and Allied shipping losses were climbing toward catastrophic levels. Every convoy that sailed from Halifax did so with the knowledge that it would be hunted. The escort vessels, corvettes, and destroyers of the Royal Canadian Navy did their best, but the escorts were too few, the ocean too vast, and the U-boats too skilled. Ships were torpedoed, ships sank, men died in the freezing water, often within sight of their convoy mates, who were under orders not to stop. The convoy pressed on. The cargo, whatever survived the weather and the torpedoes, continued toward its destination. And the documentation system continued to function, recording losses and arrivals with the same bureaucratic neutrality, filing the records of sunken ships alongside the records of ships that made it through, the dead and the delivered treated with the same administrative thoroughness. The convoy that carried cargo item 2331 suffered losses. At least one vessel was torpedoed and sunk during the crossing, and the cargo aboard that vessel was recorded as lost, entered into the file with the methodical precision that the system brought to all its entries, whether the entry recorded a safe delivery or catastrophe. The torpedoed ship's cargo manifest was cross-referenced against the convoy departure manifest, and the lost items were identified and listed. Insurance claims were generated, notifications were sent. The bureaucratic consequences of the sinking unfolded with the same orderly regularity as the bureaucratic consequences of a successful delivery. The system made no distinction between tragedy and routine. Both were processed, both were filed, both generated paper, but cargo item 2331 was not aboard the torpedoed vessel. It was assigned to a ship that survived the crossing, that arrived at its destination port, that was unloaded in the normal manner by British dockyard workers who processed its cargo through the British reception system. The ship arrived, its cargo was received, and item 2331, which should have been among the received items, was not. None of this exists. The British arrival records for the convoy in question have been preserved at the National Archives in Kew, and they are, for most of the convoy's cargo, complete. Ships are listed, cargo tallies are provided, individual items are checked against the Halifax departure manifest. The records note several items that were damaged in transit and a small number that were lost when one vessel in the convoy was torpedoed and sunk, a not uncommon occurrence in the winter of 1942, when the Battle of the Atlantic was at its most ferocious. The torpedoed ship is identified, its cargo is listed as lost, insurance claims were filed, the documentation is thorough, but cargo item 2331 is not among the lost items because it was not assigned to the torpedoed vessel. It was assigned to a ship that arrived safely, that was unloaded in the normal manner, and whose cargo was processed through the standard British reception system. And yet, item 2331 does not appear on the British arrival manifest. It is not listed as received. It is not listed as damaged. It is not listed as lost. It is simply not there. This is the point at which the mystery stops being a matter of clerical error and becomes something more troubling. A missing entry on a warehouse tally sheet can be explained by a busy clerk. A stevedore's memory that does not match the records can be explained by the passage of time. But a cargo item that appears on a departure manifest and does not appear on the corresponding arrival manifest is a different category of problem. It means that somewhere between Halifax and the United Kingdom, or somewhere within the documentation systems of those two endpoints, the crate was removed from the official record. Not lost, not destroyed, removed. The distinction matters because a loss generates paperwork, a torpedoed ship generates an incident report, a damaged crate generates an inspection record. A crate that falls overboard generates a notation in the ship's log. Every form of physical loss in the wartime convoy system had a corresponding form of documentation. But item 2331 generated no loss documentation at all. It simply ceased to appear, and the only way for an item to cease appearing in a system this thorough is for someone or for some process to have ensured that it did. Let the thought deepen for a moment. Breathe with it. Consider the weight of what it implies. We are not talking about a dramatic disappearance, not a heist, not a conspiracy, not a spy novel. We are talking about a bureaucratic absence, a line that should be on a page and is not, a receipt that should exist and does not, the silence of a system that was built to speak, to document, to record, and that in this one instance chose not to, or was made not to, or was structured in a way that allowed the silence to occur without anyone needing to choose it at all. Because there is another possibility, one that is perhaps more unsettling than deliberate removal. It is the possibility that cargo item 2331 did not disappear through any single act of concealment, but through the cumulative effect of the system's own design. Consider the path again. The crate enters the Halifax system through a restricted intake process that generates minimal documentation. It passes through a warehouse whose tally sheet does not record its presence. It is loaded onto a ship by a team that operates outside the normal stevedore gangs. It appears on a convoy manifest, but generates no corresponding entry in the vessel's own hold inventory. It crosses the Atlantic and arrives at a British port where the arrival manifest does not list it. At every stage, the documentation is thin, not because someone is hiding something, but because the crate's classification code places it in a handling stream where thin documentation is the standard. The security protocols that were designed to protect sensitive cargo from enemy intelligence have the side effect of protecting it from the Allies' own record-keeping system. The crate does not need to be deliberately hidden. It is hidden by the very procedures that were supposed to keep it safe. And this raises a question that extends far beyond the specific case of one missing crate in one wartime convoy. It is a question about the nature of bureaucratic systems themselves. When a system is designed to be thorough, but certain categories within that system are exempted from thoroughness for reasons of security, the system develops a blind spot, a zone in which items can exist on paper, but not in reality, or in reality, but not on paper, and in which the discrepancy between the two is not a bug, but a feature. The blind spot does not require conspiracy to operate. It does not require corruption or theft or deliberate sabotage. It requires only that the system be followed exactly as designed. The very rules that make the system work are the rules that make the blind spot possible. This is the point at which we must consider the rail and warehouse systems that operated in parallel with the dockyard door, because if cargo item 2331 did not cross the Atlantic, if it was diverted from its assigned vessel before the convoy sailed, then it entered a different chain of documentation entirely, one that leads not to the ports of the United Kingdom, but to the interior of Canada. The Canadian National Railway operated a dedicated military freight service out of Halifax during the war, running trains from the dockyard area to destinations across the country: Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto, and dozens of smaller depots and military installations. The most sensitive of these rail shipments were the armed guard trains that carried Operation Fish crates from the docks to the Bank of Canada vaults. But the military freight service also handled a wide range of other classified and semi-classified cargo, from weapons components to scientific instruments to sealed containers whose contents were known only to the sending and receiving agencies. The rail system maintained its own documentation, waybills, loading records, guard rosters, and arrival confirmations. And this documentation was, in theory, supposed to interface with the dockyard's records at the point of transfer. When a crate was moved from a dockyard warehouse to a rail car, a transfer receipt was generated. The receipt bore the crate's identification number, its weight, its destination, and the signature of both the dockyard official releasing it and the railway official receiving it. For cargo item 2331, no transfer receipt to the rail system has been found. To appreciate the significance of this absence, you have to understand the physical geography of the transfer process. The dockyard at Halifax was connected to the Canadian National Railway system by a spur line that ran directly from the waterfront into the main rail corridor. Cargo that was designated for inland destinations, military depots, government warehouses, research facilities, bank vaults, was loaded from the dockyard warehouses onto rail cars at a loading platform that sat during the war years within the secure perimeter of the military port area. The loading was done under armed guard for classified shipments. RCMP officers, in some cases supplemented by military police, supervised the transfer of sensitive crates from the warehouse to the rail car, and an armed guard rode with the shipment to its destination. The guard carried a manifest, a rail manifest, distinct from the dockyard manifest and the convoy manifest, that listed the items in the shipment and their destination. At the receiving end, the guard's manifest was checked against the cargo, a receipt was signed, and the circle of documentation was closed. This was the system as designed. In practice, the system was subject to the same pressures and imperfections that affected every other part of the Halifax logistics chain. The rail loading platform was small and frequently congested. Multiple shipments were often being processed simultaneously, with crates from different dockyard warehouses arriving at the platform at the same time for loading onto different rail cars bound for different destinations. The rail manifests, like the dockyard manifests, were produced under time pressure and were sometimes completed after the fact, then from memory rather than from direct observation. And the guard system, while rigorous for the highest classification shipments like Operation Fish, was less consistently applied to the middle tier of sensitive material, the tier in which cargo item 2331 was classified. A crate in that middle tier might have been transferred to a rail car without the full armed guard protocol. It might have been loaded alongside other items in a mixed shipment, its individual identity submerged in a collective manifest that listed only the total number of crates and their aggregate weight. It might have been transferred from the dockyard to the rail platform during a shift change. When the outgoing crew's documentation did not perfectly align with the incoming crew's count. Any of these scenarios is plausible, and any of them would explain the absence of a transfer receipt for a specific individual crate. The system was designed to track shipments. It was less reliably designed to track individual items within shipments, and the difference between tracking a shipment and tracking an item is, once again, the kind of gap in which a single crate could disappear without triggering any alarm. There is one additional complication in the rail system's documentary chain, and it involves the waybills, the standard Canadian National Railway shipping documents that accompanied freight shipments across the country. During the war, military freight moved on government waybills that were, in many cases, less detailed than the commercial waybills used for civilian cargo. A commercial waybill typically included a description of the goods, their weight, their value, and their consignee. A government waybill for classified military freight often included only the weight, the number of pieces, and a destination code. The contents were not described. The consignee was identified by a code rather than a name, and the waybill itself was treated as a classified document, filed separately from the railway's normal shipping records and subject to the same retention and destruction schedules that governed other military paperwork. Many of these classified waybills were destroyed after the war. Those that survived are scattered across multiple record groups in Library and Archives Canada, often uncatalogued or catalogued under generic descriptions that give no indication of their contents. Just searching for a specific waybill, one that might record the rail transfer of a specific crate from the Halifax dockyard to an unknown inland destination, is in practice a task so vast and so poorly indexed that it borders on the impossible. This is not conclusive. Rail transfer records from the war years are fragmentary at best. Many were classified, many were destroyed in routine post-war file reductions, and many were simply lost in the institutional upheaval that accompanied the end of hostilities and the rapid demobilization of the military logistics apparatus. The absence of a rail transfer receipt does not prove that the crate was not transferred to a train, but it adds another negative space to the growing collection of absences that define the crate's trajectory. No warehouse tally entry, no vessel hold inventory entry, no British arrival receipt, no rail transfer receipt. Each individual absence can be explained, but the accumulation of absences begins to describe a pattern, not a pattern of events, but a pattern of non-events, a pattern of things that should have happened and didn't, records that should exist and don't, entries that should be there and aren't. And here you might feel, as the layers of the story settle over you, a peculiar kind of drowsiness that has nothing to do with fatigue and everything to do with the nature of the problem itself. Because of what we have been doing as we trace the documentary trail of cargo item 2331 is not really detective work. Detective work implies a crime, a culprit, a solution waiting to be discovered. This is something different. This is archival archaeology, the slow excavation of a system's own sediment, John, layer by layer, looking not for a buried object, but for the shape of a buried absence. An absence, unlike presence, does not reveal itself when you dig down to it. Absence is the same at every depth. The gap in the tally sheet looks the same whether the crate was lost, diverted, stolen, or simply miscounted. The missing arrival receipt looks the same whether the crate reached Liverpool and was processed through a different system or never left Halifax at all. The absence does not explain itself. It simply persists at every level of investigation as the same quiet negative space. This is why the mystery of the Halifax crate is not, in the end, a solvable mystery. It is not a puzzle with a clever answer hidden inside it. It is a demonstration of something about the relationship between systems and reality that is true always and everywhere, but that we rarely have occasion to see so clearly. Systems record what they are designed to record. They do not record what they are not designed to record. And the gap between those two categories, between what the system captures and what it lets pass through, is not a flaw in the system. It is the system. Every bureaucracy, every database, every filing cabinet, every archive operates on the same principle. It preserves what falls within its categories and silently discards what falls between them. The system does not lie. It does not deceive. It simply does not see what it was not built to see. And the crate, whatever it was, wherever it went, and fell into the space between the categories, between classified and routine, between documented and restricted, between filed and forgotten. And the system, functioning perfectly, let it pass through without leaving a mark. There is one more archival thread to follow before the trail goes completely cold, and it involves the warehouse reassignment system that the Halifax dockyard used to manage cargo that missed its assigned convoy. It happened more often than you might expect. A crate would be designated for a particular ship in a particular convoy, but delays in processing, changes in the convoy schedule, or last-minute reconfigurations of the loading plan could result in the crate being held back when the convoy sailed. When this happened, the crate was supposed to be returned to warehouse storage and reassigned to the next available convoy, a process that generated a specific form known as a reassignment notice. The notice recorded the original convoy assignment, the reason for the holdback, and the new assignment. It was a bureaucratic bridge between one paper trail and the next, ensuring that no item fell into the gap between convoys. For cargo item 2331, no reassignment notice has been found. This means one of three things. Either the crate sailed with its assigned convoy, as the manifest indicates, in which case its absence from the British arrival records is the primary mystery, or the crate was held back, but the reassignment notice was never generated or has since been lost, in which case it may have been shipped on a later convoy under a different item number, effectively given a new identity within the system, its original designation abandoned. Or the crate was held back and was never reassigned at all, diverted to a different destination through a channel that did not use the standard reassignment process. Each of these possibilities leads to a different kind of disappearance. The first is a disappearance within the transatlantic documentation chain. The second is a disappearance through bureaucratic identity loss, the crate ceasing to be item 2331 and becoming something else. Its history severed by the act of renumbering. The third is a disappearance through diversion, the crate leaving the convoy system entirely and entering a parallel logistics stream from which no records have surfaced. And the honest answer is that we do not know which of these things happened. The evidence does not resolve The fragments do not assemble into a complete picture. What we are left with is not a conclusion, but a set of possibilities, each of which is consistent with the surviving records, and none of which can be confirmed or eliminated with certainty. The crate exists in a state of documentary superposition, simultaneously shipped and not shipped, arrived and not arrived, transferred and not transferred, its fate indeterminate, not because the truth is unknowable in some philosophical sense, but because the system that was supposed to record the truth was not, in this instance, equal to the task. And now we must turn to the most uncomfortable possibility of all, not that the crate was lost through accident or error, but that its disappearance from the record was deliberate, not in the dramatic sense of a cover-up, not in the conspiratorial sense of a shadowy hand reaching into a filing cabinet to remove a page, but in the institutional sense of a system that had built into itself the capacity to erase, and that used that capacity routinely, quietly, and without any single individual needing to make the decision. The wartime censorship apparatus at Halifax was, by any measure, one of the most effective information control systems ever deployed on Canadian soil. The Press Censor's Journal, now held at the Nova Scotia Archives as part of an East Coast port collection, is itself a document of remarkable contradictions. The censor, whose name and rank are recorded in the archive's catalog, kept a personal record of his work that is far more detailed than any of his official reports. He describes the convoys he observed from his office window. He describes the cargo operations he witnessed on the docks. He describes, in some cases, the specific types of material he was required to suppress from press coverage, not the classified details themselves, but the categories of information that fell under his authority. He notes more than once that the line between legitimate security censorship and the suppression of embarrassing or inconvenient information was not always clear, and that he sometimes received instructions to suppress information whose military sensitivity he questioned. The journal is, in a sense, a meta document, a record of the process by which records were shaped, edited, and constrained. It does not tell you what was censored, but it tells you that censorship was more pervasive and more nuanced than the simple suppression of ship names and convoy schedules. It tells you that the documentary record of Halifax Harbor was, from its inception, a curated record, shaped not just by the limitations of the men who produced it, but by the deliberate decisions of the men who controlled what it was allowed to contain. The censor's photographs tell a similar story. Hundreds of images survive, views of the harbor, the docks, the ships, the loading operations. They are invaluable as visual records, but they are also censored records. The censor decided which photographs were taken, which were preserved, and which were captioned. A photograph that showed a particular type of cargo being loaded might be taken for the internal record, but withheld from any public or semi-public collection. A photograph that showed the markings on a crate might be preserved, but with the caption stripped of any identifying detail. The images that survive are the images the censor allowed to survive, and they represent not the totality of what was photographed, but the subset of photographs that passed through the filter of the censorship apparatus. What was photographed and then suppressed, what the censor's lens captured but the censor's authority prevented from being preserved, is another category of lost information, another layer of the archival absence that surrounds the story of the Halifax crate. The press censor's office, operating from within the city, had the authority to suppress any information about convoy movements, cargo shipments, naval operations, or port activities that might be of value to the enemy. This authority was exercised not just over newspapers and radio broadcasts, but over personal correspondence, official reports, and, critically, over the documentary records generated by the port itself. The censor's journal, portions of which survive in the Nova Scotia archives, reveals the scope of this authority. Photographs of the harbor were censored. Descriptions of specific ships were censored. References to the type, quantity, or destination of cargo were censored. Even the names of the docks and piers where loading took place were considered sensitive information and were routinely omitted or altered in records that might be seen by anyone outside the authorized chain of command. The effect of this censorship on the documentary record was profound and permanent. Records that were created under censorship were not, in most cases, later restored to their uncensored state. When the war ended and the censorship apparatus was dismantled, the records it had shaped, the manifests with their coded cargo descriptions, the logs with their omitted details, the reports with their redacted paragraphs, remained as they were. The censored version became the permanent version. The information that had been suppressed for security reasons during the war was not added back into the record after the war, because in most cases, no one remembered what had been suppressed, no one had kept an uncensored copy, and no institutional mechanism existed for restoring what the censor had removed. The wartime record of Halifax Harbor is, in this sense, a permanently censored document. It shows what the censor allowed to be shown, and the rest, the details that were removed or never recorded in the first place, is gone. Not classified, not sealed, not waiting in a restricted archive for eventual release. Simply gone, in the way that information is gone when no copy of it was ever made. This is different from secrecy. Secrecy implies that the information exists somewhere, preserved in a classified file, waiting to be revealed when the appropriate authority decides the time is right. Censorship of the kind practiced at Halifax during the war is more permanent. It does not preserve the information in a restricted form. It removes the information from all forms simultaneously, from the public record, from the official record, and from the institutional memory of the system that created it. A censored cargo entry is not a classified cargo entry. A classified entry exists in a restricted file that can, in principle, be declassified. A censored entry never existed in any file. The information was intercepted at the point of creation and prevented from becoming a record at all. The distinction is crucial, and it is one that most people, including most researchers, do not fully appreciate. When you look at a wartime manifest from Halifax and see a cargo item described as special stores or engineering parts or simply left blank, you are not looking at a classified document. You are looking at a censored document. The real description, the true contents of the crate, its actual origin, its intended destination may never have been written down in any form that the dockyard system preserved. The censor did not hide the truth. The censor prevented the truth from being recorded. Apply this understanding to cargo item 2331, and the implications are immediate. The classification code on the crate placed it in the sensitive material tier, a tier that, as we have seen, generated reduced documentation and restricted handling. But the censor's authority extended beyond the mere reduction of documentation. The censor could alter documentation. A manifest entry could be changed, a warehouse tally could be adjusted, a transfer record could be omitted, not because anyone was trying to make the crate disappear, but because the censor determined that the existing documentation contained details that were too specific, too revealing, or too traceable for the security standards of the moment. The censor did not need to know what was inside the crate, the sensor only needed to determine that the documentation surrounding the crate exceeded the permitted level of detail for its classification tier. And the correction, the reduction of that documentation to an acceptable level, would look from the outside exactly like a gap in the record, exactly like a disappearance. There is a photograph in the Nova Scotia archives that is sometimes cited in discussions of classified cargo handling at Halifax. It is one of the censor's own photographs, part of the official visual record of port operations that was maintained for internal use, and that was not made available to the public until decades after the war. The photograph shows a section of the dockyard during what appears to be a loading operation. Crates are visible on the dock. A crane is positioned over an open hatch. Men in work clothes and naval uniforms are standing at various points around the scene. The photograph is captioned with a date and a dock number, but no other identifying information. No ship name, no convoy designation, no description of the cargo being loaded. When researchers have compared the photograph to the dockyard logs for the date and dock number indicated in the caption, they have found a discrepancy. The log for that date records the loading of 14 crates at that dock. The photograph, when examined carefully, appears to show 15 crates. The discrepancy is minor, one crate, and it could easily be an artifact of the photograph itself. The angle of the shot, the stacking arrangement, the shadows of other objects on the dock could all create the appearance of an additional crate where none actually exists. But the discrepancy has been noted, and it has resisted resolution, and in the context of a system where visual records and textual records were produced by different people under different constraints. And it is a reminder that even the most careful documentation system can produce contradictions that no amount of subsequent analysis can fully explain. Let yourself settle into the strangeness of that for a moment. A photograph that may or may not show one crate more than the log records. A tally sheet that does not include an item the manifest says passed through. A stevedore who remembers something the records deny. A departure entry with no arrival counterpart. Each piece of evidence, examined alone, is inconclusive, but examined together, they trace the outline of something, not a conspiracy, not a cover-up, but a systemic condition, a condition in which the records are simultaneously present and insufficient, a condition in which every individual document appears to be complete, and yet the sum of the documents does not add up to a complete picture. The system did not fail in any single dramatic way. It succeeded at everything it was designed to do. And the thing it was designed to do, ultimately, was to process cargo through a logistics chain under conditions of maximum secrecy. It was not designed to produce truth. It was designed to produce movement. And movement, as the filing cabinets in Ottawa silently attest, does not require truth. It requires only documentation. Which brings us to the archives themselves, because if the answer to the mystery of cargo item 2331 exists anywhere, it exists in the layered, fragmented, imperfectly cataloged collections of documents that are held in the institutions charged with preserving Canada's wartime history. And the state of those collections is itself a part of the story. Library and Archives. Canada, the National Repository, holds Record Group 24, the vast collection of Royal Canadian Navy records that includes the convoy reports of proceedings, the primary source for convoy-level cargo documentation. The collection also includes administrative files, personnel records, operational orders, and intelligence summaries. It is enormous, it is essential, and it is incomplete. When the war ended and the Canadian military began the process of demobilization, one of the administrative tasks that accompanied the reduction of the armed forces was the weeding of files, the systematic review and selective destruction of records that were deemed to be of no continuing value. The weeding process was governed by retention schedules that specified how long different categories of records should be kept before being destroyed. Routine administrative files were given the shortest retention periods. Operational records were given longer ones. Classified records were, in theory, retained indefinitely, but the definition of classified was not always applied consistently. And the weeding process itself was carried out by clerks who were often working from incomplete instructions under pressure to clear filing cabinets for peacetime use, and without the specialized knowledge needed to assess the historical or intelligence value of individual documents. The result was an archive that is both comprehensive and riddled with gaps. You can find in Record Group 24 extraordinarily detailed records of convoy movements, escort assignments, and vessel histories. You can find in many cases the specific cargo manifests for individual convoys, including the one that carried item 2331. But you can also find scattered through the collection evidence of what is no longer there, file folders that are empty but still bear their original labels, suggesting that their contents were removed at some point. Catalog entries that reference documents that cannot be located, and occasional marginal notations in surviving files that refer to companion documents or cross-reference files that no longer exist. The archive remembers that it once contained more than it currently does, but it does not remember, in most cases, exactly what was removed or why. The Nova Scotia Archive presents a different but complementary picture. Its wartime holdings include the press censor's journal and photographs, dockyard records that were maintained at the provincial rather than federal level, and a collection of documents that were donated by private individuals, former dockyard workers, naval officers, and port officials. In the decades after the war, these private donations are a particularly interesting category because they sometimes contain documents that do not appear in any official collection. A retired customs officer's personal papers might include a carbon copy of an inspection form that was destroyed in the federal files. A former naval officer's diary might reference a classified shipment that does not appear in the surviving official records. These fragments of private memory and private documentation form a shadow archive, an unofficial record that sits alongside the official one and that occasionally, tantalizingly, fills in a gap that the official record cannot explain. It was in one such private collection donated to the Nova Scotia Archives in the mid-1990s that a document was found that has been described with appropriate caution as the closest thing to a link in the chain of cargo item 2331 that has ever surfaced outside the federal records. The document is a handwritten note, apparently drafted by a dockyard clerk, that lists a series of cargo items with their classification codes and disposition notes. The note is undated, but appears, based on the paper type and the handwriting style, to be consistent with documents from the early 1940s. Most of the items on the list have disposition notes that are routine, loaded, transferred, warehoused. But one item whose classification code is consistent with the code assigned to item 2331 bears a disposition note that reads in full, held, returned to special stores, see separate. See separate. The note refers to a separate document, a document that is not included in the collection that has not been located in any other archive and that may or may not have ever been filed in a retrievable form. See separate is one of the most common and most frustrating phrases in archival research. It means that the writer knew more, that the full story was recorded somewhere else, and that the connection between this document and that one was supposed to be maintained by the filing system. But filing systems, as anyone who has worked in one will tell you, maintain connections only as long as someone maintains the filing system. And in the chaos of wartime, the upheaval of demobilization, the decades of institutional reorganization that followed, the connection between a handwritten note and its separate was severed. The note survives. The separate does not. And the story it might have told, the explanation of why an item with the classification code of cargo, item 2331, was held back, returned to special stores, and processed through a channel that required a separate document is one more thing that the system preserved the shadow of without preserving the substance. This is what archives do. They preserve selectively, not because the archivists are negligent. The people who maintain these collections are, in the main, dedicated professionals who understand the value of what they hold and who work tirelessly, to make it accessible. But because all archives are the product of decisions about what to keep and what to destroy, what to catalog and what to leave uncatalogued, what to make accessible and what to restrict. These decisions are made under constraints of space, funding, staffing, and institutional priority, and they are made inevitably without full knowledge of what future researchers will need. An archivist in 1950, weeding the naval files to make room for peacetime records, could not have known that 60 years later, someone would want to trace the path of one specific crate through the Halifax dockyard system. The file that might have contained the answer, the separate that the handwritten note refers to, may have been destroyed not because it was sensitive, but because it was, to the person making the decision, unremarkable. One more warehouse transfer record in a system that had generated millions. One more piece of paper in a filing cabinet that needed to be emptied. And so the trail ends, not with a revelation, but with a silence, not with a locked door, but with an empty shelf. The crate was loaded, the crate was documented, the crate was processed through a system that was designed with extraordinary thoroughness to track every item that moved through one of the most important military ports in the Allied world. And yet the system, for all its thoroughness, could not or did not record where this one crate ultimately went. The documentation exists for the crate's entry into the system. It does not exist for the crate's exit. And in the space between entry and exit, in the gap between the first record and the last, the crate has remained for more than 80 years. Not lost in the physical sense, because no one has evidence that it was lost, but lost in the documentary sense, which is to say, lost to knowledge, lost to history, lost to the ability of anyone to say with certainty what happened to it. This is the kind of loss that archives specialize in, not the dramatic loss of a fire or a flood, though those happen too, but the quiet loss of attrition, the loss that occurs when a filing system is reorganized and a cross-reference is broken, the loss that occurs when a retention schedule is applied and a category of record is destroyed. Nighton, the loss that occurs when a clerk working late on a winter night in Halifax writes, "See separate" on a handwritten note and files the separate in a place that no one will ever find again. These are the losses that happen inside systems, and they are, in their own way, more complete than any external catastrophe could achieve. A fire destroys records indiscriminately. Some survive, some do not, and the destruction is visible in the charred edges and the water stains. But a bureaucratic loss is invisible. The document that was never filed looks exactly like a document that never existed. The gap in the record looks exactly like a record that was never created. And the only evidence that something is missing is the faint, persistent sense that the story does not quite add up. That the numbers on the tally sheet should include one more entry, that the manifest should have a corresponding receipt, that the note should have it separate. Let us pause here and consider what the bureaucracy preserved, because it did preserve something enormous, something invaluable, something that forms the foundation of everything we know about the convoy war in the Atlantic. The system worked, the convoys sailed, the cargo in its vast majority arrived, the paper trail, for all its gaps and contradictions, provides a record of one of the most extraordinary logistical achievements in human history, the sustained movement of millions of tons of material across thousands of miles of ocean through enemy submarine patrols and winter storms, under conditions that would have overwhelmed any system less rigorously documented than the one that operated out of Halifax Harbor. The convoy reports of proceedings in Record Group 24 are not failures of documentation. They are monuments to it. They record the dates and times of convoy assemblies, the formation patterns, the escort assignments, the weather conditions, the submarine contacts, the evasive maneuvers, the losses. They record with a precision that still impresses the movements of hundreds of ships across years of continuous operations. The system preserved the war's logistics with a fidelity that allows historians, decades later, to reconstruct individual convoy crossings down to the hour. And the censorship system, for all its implications for the crate mystery, was not a conspiracy to destroy truth. It was a desperate, necessary measure to protect the lives of the men who sailed the convoys. The information that the censor suppressed, the names of ships, the schedules of convoys, the types and quantities of cargo, was information that, if obtained by German intelligence, could have been used to direct submarine attacks with devastating precision. The suppression of that information saved lives. The manifests that listed gold as fish and weapons components as engineering parts were not lies in the moral sense. They were survival strategies. The censor was not hiding the truth from posterity. The censor was hiding the truth from the enemy. That the two objectives proved to be, in the long run, the same thing, that the information hidden from the enemy was also hidden from future researchers and from the historical record itself, is a consequence that the censor could not have anticipated and that the system was not designed to prevent. So the bureaucracy preserved logistics, it preserved movement, it preserved the vast operational fact of the convoy war. What it did not preserve, what it was structurally incapable of preserving, was the specific truth of individual items that fell below the threshold of institutional attention. A convoy that arrives safely is documented as a successful operation. The individual crates within that convoy are documented only insofar as they generate paperwork at the receiving end, arrival receipts, inspection forms, transfer records. If a crate generates no paperwork at the receiving end, it leaves the system's field of vision. It does not trigger an alarm. It does not generate an investigation. It does not produce the cascade of documentation that a reported loss would produce. It simply passes through the system and exits on the other side without leaving a mark. And the system, having processed it and filed the departure records, moves on to the next convoy, the next fleet of ships, the next mountain of crates waiting on the docks. This is what the bureaucracy preserved: the fact of movement without the fact of arrival, the record of departure without the record of destination, the documentation of a crate's entry into the system without the documentation of its exit. And in preserving the one without the other, the bureaucracy created something that it did not intend and could not control: a permanent, institutionalized uncertainty. Not a mystery in the romantic sense of a puzzle waiting to be solved, but a mystery in the structural sense of a question that the system's own design makes unanswerable, and the information needed to answer the question was either never recorded, and then destroyed, or recorded and then lost in the vast accumulation of paper that the system generated over 6 years of continuous operations. The system was not hiding the answer. The system simply never held the answer in a form that could survive. And this is what reality lost. Not just a crate, though the crate is real and its contents, whatever they were, mattered to someone, but the connection between documentation and truth. The naive confidence that if something is written down, it is preserved. That if a system generates records, but those records reflect what happened. That if a filing cabinet contains a manifest, the manifest tells the full story. Reality lost the assumption that thoroughness equals truth, because the Halifax dockyard system was thorough. It was extraordinarily thorough, and it still could not, or did not, preserve the truth of what happened to one sealed military crate in one winter convoy in 1 year of a 6-year war. Let yourself breathe with this for a moment. Feel the weight of the blankets or the pillow or whatever is holding you in place right now. The archive is far away. The harbor is far away. The winter of 1942 is far away. But the principle of the gap, the principle of the system that preserves movement and loses meaning, that is not far away at all. It is in every record you have ever signed, every form you have ever filled out, every receipt that was supposed to prove something and that years later proves only that a form was filled out. The gap between documentation and truth is not a wartime phenomenon. It is a universal one. It is the space in which cargo item 2331 disappeared, and it is the space in which 1,000 other truths, small and large, documented and undocumented, disappear every day. Not into darkness, not into destruction, but into the quiet, orderly, well-maintained silence of systems that were built to process the world, not to understand it. Think about what that means, not just for the crate, but for everything the system touched. If one item can pass through the center of the most documented military logistics system of its era and leave no trace of where it went, how many other items did the same? The honest answer is that we do not know, and the system provides no mechanism for finding out. We cannot search for what is not there. We cannot catalog what was never recorded. We can only notice in those rare instances where a departure record survives without an arrival record, or where a tally sheet does not match a manifest, or where a handwritten note refers to a document that cannot be found, that the system's thoroughness was not as complete as its designers intended and its users believed. And even then, even when we notice the gap, we cannot say with certainty whether the gap represents a loss, a diversion, an error, or a deliberate erasure. The gap is the gap. It tells us that something is missing. It does not tell us what. There is a particular kind of vertigo that comes from spending too long in archives. It is not the vertigo of heights or the vertigo of spinning. It is the vertigo of paper, the dizzying realization that you are surrounded by records, that were produced by a system designed to record everything, and that the records, for all their volume, do not add up to a complete picture of what happened. You can read 1,000 pages of convoy reports and come away with a detailed understanding of how the system worked, how ships were assembled, how cargo was loaded, how convoys were routed and escorted and defended. You can come away feeling that you understand the war at sea in a way that the men who fought it never could, because you have the records, the dates, the numbers, the patterns, and then you come across a gap, a missing receipt, an unexplained notation, a reference to a document that does not exist, and the vertigo hits. Because the gap tells you that the picture you have been assembling is not complete, that the records you have been reading are not the whole story, that the system, for all its impressive thoroughness, was generating an official version of events that was not necessarily identical to the events themselves. This is not a failure peculiar to wartime. It is a feature of all documentary systems in all eras, under all conditions. Tax records do not tell you who evaded taxes. Census records do not tell you who was not counted. Court records do not tell you about the cases that were never brought. Land records do not tell you about the occupants who were never registered. Every documentary system preserves what it was designed to preserve, and in doing so, it creates a category of things that exist outside its design, things that happened but were not recorded, things that were recorded but not preserved, things that were preserved but not cataloged, things that were cataloged but not accessible. The archival record is not a mirror of reality. It is a shadow of reality cast by the light of institutional attention, and the shape of the shadow depends entirely on the angle of the light. In the case of cargo item 2331, the light was angled in a way that illuminated the crate's entry into the system, and then, whether by accident, by design, or by some combination of both, failed to illuminate its exit. The crate is visible in the loading record. It is visible on the convoy manifest. And then the light moves on to the next convoy, the next page, the next file. And the crate passes into the shadow, not because anyone turned the light away, but because the light was never pointed at the place where the crate went next. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of this story. Not that a crate disappeared, but that disappearance is a normal function of documentary systems, that the systems we build to record the truth are by their nature incomplete, that every archive is a collection of presences surrounded by an ocean of absences, that the filing cabinet in Ottawa, with its meticulous manifests and its initialed receipts, is not a repository of truth, but a repository of documentation, and that the difference between those two things is the space in which whole objects, whole histories, whole truths can vanish without anyone noticing they are gone. Consider for a moment, the people who handled cargo item 2331, the dockyard clerk who entered it in the intake log, the warehouse worker who may or may not have processed it through the storage facility, the stevedore or the specialist team that loaded it onto the ship, the military police officer who may have supervised its handling, the ship's officer who signed the manifest, the censor who may have reviewed the documentation. Each of these people had a small piece of the crate's story. Each of them saw one link in the chain. None of them saw the whole chain. None of them knew where the crate came from before it reached their hands or where it was going after it left. The system was designed this way, compartmentalization, the division of knowledge, so that no single person holds the complete picture, was a deliberate security measure. It protected sensitive cargo by ensuring that even if one link in the chain was compromised, The compromise would not extend to the whole, but it also meant that no one at any point was in a position to notice if the chain was broken. Each person did their part, documented their part, and passed the crate to the next person who did the same. And if the crate at some point in that chain was not passed, if it stopped or was diverted or was set aside and forgotten, the system had no mechanism for detecting the interruption. Each person had completed their documentation, each receipt was signed, each form was filed, and the crate was gone. This is how truth dies inside systems. Not with a lie, not with a conspiracy, not with a dramatic act of destruction, but with a series of small, correct, properly documented steps, each of which is complete in itself, and none of which individually is wrong. The intake clerk recorded the crate's arrival correctly. The manifest clerk listed it correctly. The warehouse worker, if the crate passed through the warehouse, processed it correctly according to whatever instructions applied. Every person in the chain did their job. Every form was filled out. Every procedure was followed. And at the end of all that correctness, all that diligence, all that meticulous attention to the forms and the signatures and the filing protocols, the truth of what happened to one sealed military crate was not preserved. Not because anyone failed, but because preservation of truth was never the system's primary function. The system's primary function was to move cargo. And cargo, as the convoy system proved over 6 years and thousands of crossings, does not need truth to move. It needs only paperwork, and the paperwork survives. That is the final unsettling irony. The paperwork that could not tell you where the crate went can tell you with exquisite precision what the weather was like on the day it was loaded. It can tell you the tonnage of the convoy, the names of the escort vessels, the course headings, the fuel consumption rates. It can tell you what the stevedore gangs were paid and how many hours they worked. It can tell you the name of the convoy commodore and the signal that was used to order the fleet to sail. It can give you a detailed, authoritative, thoroughly documented picture of everything that happened around the crate. The harbor, the ships, the war, while leaving the crate itself in darkness. The system preserved the context perfectly. It preserved the background with extraordinary fidelity. And in the foreground, where the crate should be, there is only the outline of an absence, a shape in the records where something was, a silence in the archive where a story should be. There is something almost restful in that realization if you let it come to you without resistance. Not restful in the sense of comforting. It is not comforting to understand that official records are not the same thing as truth, but restful in the sense that it releases you from the expectation that the story must have an ending, because it does not. The mystery of cargo item 2331 is not a puzzle with a missing piece. It is a demonstration that the system in which the puzzle was constructed does not contain all the pieces. The piece is not hidden. It was not stolen. It was never cut. The system that was supposed to produce the piece, the arrival receipt, the transfer confirmation, the final destination record, either never produced it or produced it in a form that did not survive. And no amount of searching, no matter how diligent, can find a thing that was never made. So let the mystery be a mystery. Let the crate rest where it has rested for more than 80 years, in the space between a departure record and an empty file, between a loading dock and an unknown destination, between the Halifax harbor and whatever place, if any, the crate reached in the end. Let the stevedore's memory coexist with the records that contradict it. And let the tally sheet keep its discrepancy. Let the handwritten note refer to its missing separate. These are not failures of the historical record. They are the historical record. The record is not incomplete because something went wrong. The record is incomplete because incompleteness is what records do. They capture what the system was designed to capture, and they let everything else fall through the spaces between the forms. Somewhere in a warehouse that was torn down in the 1950s, or in the hold of a ship that was scrapped for metal after the war, or in the vault of a building that no longer serves its wartime purpose, or in the memory of a dockyard worker who is no longer alive to tell his story. The truth of cargo item 2331 existed briefly, completely, as a physical fact in a physical world. The crate was somewhere. Its contents were something. A person carried it or loaded it or opened it or stored it or forgot about it. The truth was real. It happened. It just was never in any form that has survived recorded. And if that thought feels heavy, let it settle. Let it become part of the quiet. Because there is something here that goes beyond one crate and one harbor and one war. There is a recognition, not new, not dramatic, but profound in its simplicity, that the systems we build to preserve the past are not the past, that the records we keep are not the truth they were meant to capture, that bureaucracy, for all its power and its reach and its extraordinary capacity to track and catalog and file, is not a machine for producing truth. It is a machine for producing records. And records, as cargo item 2331 silently testifies, are not the same thing. The filing cabinet in Ottawa is still there. The manifest is still there. Entry 2331 is still there. The dimensions, the weight, the classification code, the smudged signature of the dockyard official who may have been named Burwell or Burl. The convoy sailed. The war was won. The harbor at Halifax still opens to the Atlantic, though Bedford Basin no longer holds fleets of merchant ships waiting in columned formation for the order to cross. The docks have been rebuilt, the warehouses replaced, the blackout regulations a memory of a memory, but in the filing cabinet, in the thin onion skin pages that have yellowed to the color of old teeth, one entry remains, perfectly preserved, perfectly documented, and perfectly unanswered. The crate was there, the paper says so, and then the paper stops talking. Some objects disappear because they are destroyed. Some objects disappear because they are stolen. Some objects disappear because the sea takes them, or fire, or the slow entropy of time and neglect. But some objects disappear in a different way, a quieter way, a more systematic way. They disappear inside the very machinery that was built to prevent their disappearance. They are documented into existence and then documented out of it. They are processed, stamped, signed, filed, and forgotten, not by people, but by the system that people built, a system that was never designed to remember truth, only to record movement, and that, having recorded the movement, considers its job done. The Halifax crate did not vanish at sea. It did not vanish in a fire. It did not vanish in an explosion or a raid or a disaster. Always, it vanished in a filing system. It vanished between one page and the next. It vanished in the gap between a departure manifest and an arrival receipt that was never written. And the system that allowed it to vanish did not fail. It functioned exactly as designed. It processed the crate. It documented the crate. And then it moved on to the next crate and the next and the next, because the convoys were waiting and the war would not pause for one missing entry in a filing cabinet that no one would open for decades. Some objects disappear. Some truths are designed to disappear. And the most efficient machine ever built for making them disappear is not fire, not water, not the passage of time. It is paper, carefully filed paper in properly labeled drawers, in climate-controlled rooms, maintained by diligent archivists who preserve with extraordinary care the exact system that made the truth vanish in the first place. Let that settle. Let the harbor go quiet. Let the convoy sail into the dark water, the ships in their columns, the escorts on the flanks, the cargo in the holds, every crate accounted for, every manifest signed, every receipt in its proper file. And somewhere in the middle of all that order, all that documentation, all that meticulous bureaucratic certainty, one small space where the paper is blank, one small silence where there should be a record, one small absence that the system created, the system preserved, and the system will never explain. The night is deep now. The archive is closed. The filing cabinet in Ottawa holds its pages in the dark. And somewhere between the lines of a manifest that has yellowed to the color of old teeth, a crate that was loaded onto a ship in Halifax Harbor in February of 1942 continues its journey, not across the Atlantic, not to Liverpool, not to any physical destination, but deeper and deeper into the silence of a system that recorded everything except the one thing that mattered. What was in the crate? Where did it go? The system does not say. The system was never designed to say. The system was designed to process, to document, to file, and to move on. And it did. And the crate, wherever it is, remains. The one question that the most thorough documentation system of the 20th century could not answer, because answering was never part of the design. Let that be the last thought you carry into sleep. Not the mystery itself. The mystery is old, and it will be old when you wake, but the understanding beneath it, that systems do not preserve truth, they preserve themselves, that records are not reality, they are the shadow of reality cast by institutional light. And when the light moves, the shadow moves with it, and the thing that casts the shadow, the real thing, the true thing, the crate on the dock in the cold February dark, is left behind, unrecorded, unremembered, but real in a way that no filing cabinet can hold, and no manifest can describe, and no bureaucracy, however thorough, however meticulous, however carefully designed, can ever quite capture. The crate was real. The paper remembers only that it was there, and the difference between being real and being remembered is the space in which all truth eventually disappears. Not lost, not stolen, not destroyed, just unrecorded, filed away in the one drawer that no archive contains. The drawer marked what actually happened,